All right, guys. So I'm very happy to be joined right now by journalist and author Antony Loewenstein, who last year wrote a book called The Palestine Laboratory, in which he essentially details how Israel has been using the populations in the West Bank and Gaza as sort of a testing ground to then go and sell weapons and surveillance technology on the international markets. So thank you so much for coming on the channel, Antony.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I sort of just want to start off with, if you can, a brief rundown or synopsis on how we got to the point that we are right now, right? Since 1948, who are some of the more nefarious actors or governments or other, organizations that Israel has formed close relationships and tied themselves to in order to get to the point now where they are a pretty major regional, at least, military industrial powerhouse, and just describe how we got to this point.
So Israel's now about the ninth or 10th biggest arms dealer in the world. So they're a serious play. I mean, the US is number one. Israel's never going to probably unseat the US because America likes to be, sending freedom around the world in the form of bombs and missiles. But nonetheless, Israel's a tiny country. It's 9 million people and it's got a massive arms industry. And so much of those weapons and surveillance tech was trialed and tested first in the occupied territories on Palestinians over decades. So as I show in the book, 1948, of course, was the year of Israel's birth. And the weapons industry had started really before then, mostly for Zionists to try to fight the British, which, of course, successfully they overthrew the British forces there. Obviously, it was in the ashes of the Holocaust. There was a lot of Western political sympathy. Obviously, the Arab states and Palestinians opposed what was happening, to be sure, but they lost that war. And pretty much from the 50s until now, Israel has been selling massive amounts of weapons. It accelerated after 1967 when there was a six-day war. Israel took control of East Jerusalem, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. And the regimes that they partnered with, I mean, it's easier. One of the most remarkable things about doing this book was, and one of the reasons I wanted to write it is, although most of the book is set in the present moment, the history part is important because a lot of people will know the US supported repressive states since World War II. The list is long. What is far, far less known is that Israel often supported similar regimes, if not more. That history is virtually not known or arguably invisible. So we're talking about the apartheid regime in South Africa, Pinochet's regime in Chile after 1963, 1973, the first 9/11, so to speak, the regime in Guatemala in the 80s that was literally committing genocide, the Iranian regime before 1979. I mean, the list goes on and on. And just finally, what Israel was selling was, yes, the weapons and the surveillance tech. This obviously in those periods was before the digital era, but there was still repressive techniques and tools. But what Israel was also selling was the way to repress a so-called unwanted population. After 1967, quite a few nations did not like what Israel was doing. They viewed it rightly as colonialism. But the way to kind of neuter that criticism was that Israel essentially went around the world and found huge amounts of nations. And I would say then, and frankly still today, even after October 7 and the last 6 months, nations that were pretty keen to repress their own people and they wanted Israeli advice to do so. And that's how Israel, in some ways, has had this insurance policy for more than half a century of really supporting and backing and arming and training and selling weapons to around 140 nations on the planet. So the majority of countries on Earth.
So how do you square this sort of mainstream narrative that Israel is this beacon of freedom and democracy in the region? How do you square that with the fact that, as you're arguing here, it seems like that they have essentially been one of the largest exporters of tools and weapons of oppression on the world stage? How do you sort of merge those two
Yeah.
ideas together?
Well, I think a lot of that narrative, which you're absolutely correct, is coming from the country you're in, the US, but it comes from most Western countries. I'm living in Australia at the moment, and the narrative is pretty similar here. I think it comes from a few places. One, and this is occurring before 9/11, but it got frankly much worse since 9/11. There is deep-seated contempt, hatred, racism, call it whatever you want, for Muslims, for Arabs, for Palestinians in much of the mainstream media. I'm not talking about the wider society, although it's there too. There is as I've often called it, a protection racket that exists in many of the, particularly the US media. Again, not all, it's hard not to generalize. There are good journalists at most outlets, including the Murdoch press here and there. But
Right.
in general, there is a protection racket that supports Israel. There is sympathetic to Israel, to its aims, to its goals. This is across the New York Times, most media, not just the conservative press. I'm not just talking about Fox News, which you'd expect to be pro-Israel. Talking about the so-called liberal press, New Yorker, New York Times, over decades. So that's one reason. Second reason is the so-called pro-Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby, call it whatever you want, has been pretty effective or brutal, depending on your point of view, in pushing a certain perspective and bullying and lobbying certain media. And the alternative lobby, Palestinian lobby, Arab lobby, Muslim lobby, whatever it is, has not been very powerful and very weak. And it's interesting because there are far more Muslims in America, for example, than Jews. There aren't that many Jews in America. There's roughly 16 million Jews around the world. Half are in Israel, half are in the US. Obviously, there's Jews elsewhere, but it's a tiny population, really, obviously, because of the Holocaust. And yet, the Jewish community in general, although it's changing because of young Jews who are thankfully becoming far more critical, often the people who are at the forefront of these protests in the last 6 months are Jews, not all, but many younger Jews. The Muslim community has not been as organized, united, and effective, frankly, at lobbying. Uh, the US Congress speaks for itself that only really in the last 5 or so years have you finally had, we're talking about 10 or 12 politicians out of hundreds who at least express some sympathy for
Right.
Palestinians. I
Yeah.
mean the amount of pro-Israel racism in the US Congress is kind of staggering. And I think finally there is I think there's a great, I mean, yes, I said before, a degree of sympathy for the Israeli position. I would argue that has not radically changed since October 7. Yes, there was shock in many circles on that attack, and understandably in some ways. But in the last 6 months, we've seen Israel unleash hell on Gaza, 40,000 Palestinians killed, the vast majority of whom are civilians, just made the place unlivable, which of course was always the point. And what you find is increasingly that Israel and Palestine, really for the first time in my memory, and I'm close to 50 now, is going to be an election issue this year in the US. Now, it's not going to decide the election. If Trump wins, it won't be because of Gaza, or if Biden wins, it won't be because of Gaza, but it is a factor. And in some ways, that's a good thing because if you kill 40,000 Palestinians and the US supports and arms and backs Israel, you'd hope to hell it would be. But in general, in the past, it has not been a real election issue. And there are many people who potentially would have voted Democrat in the past who have said, as you will be well aware, I'm not going to vote for Trump, but over my dead body, am I going to be voting for Biden with
Right.
what he has
Right.
supported in Gaza? Now, is that going
Right.
to decide the election? Who knows? But it's a
Yeah.
factor. And that
Yeah.
to me is a welcome thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely is. I mean, we've seen unprecedented amounts of people who are going to these primary elections, typical Democratic Party supporters
Yeah.
who are showing up to the polls in the primary elections just for the only purpose of making their voice heard when it comes to trying to get an immediate
Yes.
ceasefire and the rest of that. And I think that it's important what you point out there, that there are many Jewish advocacy groups that are at the forefront of leading some of these
Mm.
protests, right? I've been to several here in Washington,
Yeah.
D.C., and some of the biggest groups are, If Not Now and Jewish Voices for
Yes.
Peace. And I think that that's important to point out because we have this massive conflation that's constantly
Mm.
going on in the U.S. media and political sphere of conflating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, or even
Yeah.
just mild critiques of what
Mm.
Israel is doing. And so I'm curious, right, because you have a Jewish background and had family members who were killed in the Holocaust, and I'm wondering how you analyze this massive wave of not only smears in the mainstream media of anybody who's critical of Israel as being anti-Semitic, but also crackdowns that we've seen, sort of authoritarian crackdowns, whether it's here in the United States or especially in Germany, with what's happened over the last couple of weeks. In some cases, literally arresting,
Yeah.
Jewish peace advocates. So I'm wondering what you
I mean,
make
the
of
irony, the
right,
irony of
right,
ironies that Germany is arresting Jewish peace activists who are calling for a ceasefire. Anyway,
right, right.
madness.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that you mentioned is obviously the sort of affiliation between Israel and South African apartheid, and South Africa bringing this case at the International Court of Justice for violations of the Genocide Convention against Israel. I'm wondering how exactly you sort of weigh that importance or the magnitude of that
Mm,
specifically being brought by South Africa.
yeah. Let me answer the first question first. So, for decades, there's always been critical Jews. That's obvious to say. But in general, they were not hugely organized, and they were frankly out-organized by the AIPACs of this world. Very hard line, I would argue, very racist against Palestinians. Any kind of sense of Palestinian rights was deemed anti-Semitic, just absurd rhetoric and policy. What's happened in the last 10 years, and this started long before October 7, but it's certainly accelerated since, has been what I call a civil war in the Jewish community. Mostly in the US, but it's happening in Europe, the UK, Australia, my country as well. And what I mean by that is, and it's not quite as neat as this, but in general, older Jews are seen as much more pro-Israel. Younger Jews are generally much more supportive of Palestine. Of course, there are older Jews that support Palestine too, but in general, it's quite generational. And that really makes sense because the what you could call romantic connection that many older Jews have with Israel, I would argue, is always based on this delusion, this sort of romantic fantasy Israel, this noble democracy fighting for its rights in a hostile region. So the argument went, ignoring a decades-long occupation. I mean, the only way, you asked me at the beginning, Mac, about Israel claiming that it's a thriving democracy in the heart of a brutal Middle East. It's true that, yes, the Middle East is mostly dictatorships, but who do you think backs most of those dictatorships? We do, we being the West, the US
Right,
particularly,
right.
and Israel for that matter. And it's interesting, the latest figures that we have for the Israeli arms industry in 2022, we haven't got the figures from last year yet. It was 12.5 billion US dollars. 24% of that were Arab autocracies.
Wow,
24%. So
wow.
essentially a quarter. So we're talking about UAE, Bahrain, Saudi, etc. And it's pretty clear since October 7, not one Arab state has cut ties with Israel. And let me tell you, not one will. Even in the last few days, we've seen when Iran was firing certain drones from Iran into Israel, it was stopped by, yes, Israeli missile defense, US, but also Arab states, Jordan and others. So many Arabs that I'm speaking to already, and many Muslims are saying, right. So there's been 6 months of a genocide in Gaza. Arab elites have done not just bugger all, but essentially still supporting Israel. Ignore the rhetoric. We're very concerned. This is like Biden every week in the media. He's increasingly concerned by Israel. Oh, he's
Right,
lovely. That's nice that the old man's concerned, but he's still selling weapons.
right,
This is
right,
what matters, right? It's just rhetorical nonsense that the media kind of eats up. It's bullshit. And that split in the Jewish community is so necessary because without Jewish diaspora support, the US principally, but also Israel would not survive.
right,
I mean, Israel obviously has its own military, as we've seen, but without US backing and frankly German backing, people aren't aware the second biggest provider of weapons to Israel since October 7 has been Germany. Massive amounts of weapons. Israel, the US is number one, as you'd expect, but Germany is number two. And that civil war in the Jewish community is so vital because it really is about reframing Judaism, which says and I'm Jewish, although I'm not religious, I'm a secular Jew. I call myself an atheist Jew, which I think in America makes sense. People find that a bit weird, but culturally Jewish, but not religious.
right.
That to be defined as a Jew through Israeli actions is such an abomination that the idea, as you rightly say, there is a deliberate conflation between Judaism and Zionism. We're told if you're anti-Zionist, for those who don't know, someone who doesn't believe in a Jewish state. Anti-Semitism obviously is actual hatred of Jews, which is real. and worries me, and in some parts of the world is growing. But you cannot fight real anti-Semitism, the far right, attacks on synagogues, Orthodox Jews, all those which are deeply concerning, when you are conflating anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and you're saying you cannot be a good human being, whether you're a Jew or otherwise, if you're critical of Israel. I mean, I would argue finally that Israeli actions long before October 7, but certainly since, are making Jews more unsafe. And the tragic irony is that Israel was set up, so the early Zionists claimed, as a refuge from European anti-Semitism. And obviously, European anti-Semitism was real. I mean, the
Right,
Holocaust
right,
really was an abomination. But here we are, 75 plus years on, and no one can credibly claim that Israel is making Jews safer. There was a piece last week that's finally by Benny Morris, who's a very right-wing
yep,
Israeli
yeah,
historian, no friend of yours or mine. He said something, he was talking about saying the war on Gaza is justified and we should go into rougher, okay, things we don't agree with. But there was one very interesting line in there, which I just want to mention, which he basically said, it's inarguable that the place that is the least safe for Jews in the world now is Israel.
right,
Now, what does that tell you? That tells you that Jews have the right to safety. Of course they do, like everyone. But that Israel and its actions is causing greater anti-Semitism. It doesn't justify violence against Jews, of course, but this is what's filling it. The average person who sees actions in Gaza says, wow, why are so many Jewish people supporting this? Now,
right,
what I often say is, well, this is a problem that if the average person sees that conflation, Jews, Zionism and Judaism is one and the same thing, it's much harder to fight real anti-Semitism. And that's the fight that many of us are trying to explain
right.
to people that, different Judaism is not simply blindly supporting Israeli violence in Gaza. God help
Yeah.
us.
And as you point out, I mean, it almost is directly contributing to, a rise of anti-Semitism, right? You are
Mm.
directly attaching all Jewish people around the world who have
Yeah,
many nuanced views on many different things and just attributing that all to the actions. I mean, it would almost be, attributing all Muslims to the actions of
totally.
Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's just
Or
it's
ISIS for
totally
that matter.
or
Of course.
ISIS, right? Exactly. It's
Indeed.
totally ridiculous. And so I want to pivot here.
Mm.
So we talked about sort of how Israel is using Palestinian territory in the West Bank and Gaza as sort of a testing ground for some of this technology. So a two-part question here. Number one, what kind of technology are we talking about that's being used here? Who potentially has an interest in purchasing and using that kind of technology? And then, the second part of the question, I guess, would be how does this play into Israel's use of programs like the Gospel and Lavender and Where's Daddy that I've talked about on this channel multiple different times over the last number of weeks that they're currently
Mm.
using in their war on
Mm.
Gaza?
Since October 7 and Israel's assault on Gaza, there's been huge amounts of weapons that they are testing and trialing. Things like suicide drones, something called a quadcopter, which is basically a form of a weaponized drone. There is AI, which I'll get to in a minute. There is huge amounts of surveillance tech. There are various American, particularly and Israeli defense companies. There are robot dogs, some armed, some not. And
Which is, by the way, the most dystopian thing you could possibly imagine, like robot dogs
absolutely,
being
robot
deployed
dogs,
in,
which,
in
by the way,
warfare.
have been, which about a year ago, I mentioned this in my book actually, have already been deployed in sections of the US-Mexico border.
Wow. Yeah.
This was, by the way, during the Biden administration. I mean,
Right.
one thing that's worth mentioning is that I'm hardly a secret Trump fan, I can assure you, but if anyone truly thinks that the border policies since Trump left have radically changed since Trump was in power. Now, you would know that, of course, and maybe viewers of this channel do, but that ain't the truth at all. Now, this is not suggesting that if Trump comes back, it won't be 1,000 times worse. It probably will, but let's be under no illusion here that in the last 3 years, the Biden administration's border policies have been brutal beyond
Absolutely.
belief.
Absolutely.
Anyway, so in the last 6 months since October 7, all these weapons have been tested. There's been two major arms fairs, one in Paris late last year, one in Singapore about a month ago. And Israel has been openly promoting these weapons at those fairs for a global market. Now, obviously, we don't know yet who's buying it, but I can assure you that in Singapore, for example, the Singaporeans are big fans of Israel. The Cambodians are, both dictatorships, and there are many others. And, for many people who see what's happening in Gaza, we're disgusted. But there are many other nations, in fact, that look at it with admiration for two reasons. One, we're 6 months in, no one's stopping Israel. Really, the war hasn't stopped, still going on. Yes, there's international outrage and the US is concerned and all that nonsense that we hear every day, but the war's still going on. The weapons are still flowing. And many other nations look to Israel with admiration and say, how do you do that? Because we have in our own countries, so they claim, our own so-called unwanted populations. How do we manage those people? Whether it's, an example that always comes to me is Myanmar in the last years, in my part of the world,
Mm.
is one of the most brutal regimes on the planet. The UN found it had committed genocide against its Rohingya population a few years ago. None of that stopped Israel still selling weapons and surveillance tech to that regime after that designation of genocide to this day. And another example, which is really worth mentioning because I think it's something that gets far too little attention, is the Israel-India relationship is central to this whole ideology. India is now the world's biggest country, took over from China last year. It is in my view, a Hindu fundamentalist regime, increasingly so. Prime Minister Modi, who's in charge there, is facing re-election and will almost certainly win. His election starts this week. The election takes a long time because it's such a big place, but essentially he will be re-elected for the third time. And India is doing what it's doing against its Muslim population for its own reasons. It's not doing it because of Israel. But it's pretty clear that in many states within India, including in Kashmir, Indian officials have openly said that what Israel is doing in Palestine inspires us. We want to copy what they're doing. There was a good example about a month ago of farmers who were protesting near Delhi, Indian farmers, cost of living, etc. And the Indian officials were using drones, dropping tear gas on them. They didn't kill them, but it was obviously hurting them. And the Indian officials openly said, we saw this happening in Gaza 5 years ago when we were there during the Gaza Great March of Return, which is in 2018, 2019.
Mhm.
And we saw that and we thought, we could do something similar to our own population.
Wow.
Now, I use that as an example. There are so many others. Now, again, to be clear, India is going to do what India is going to do. It doesn't need, inverted commas, Israel to do it.
But it's an
But
it's
this
an
model,
overlap of
indeed,
ethno-nationalist
yes,
tendencies, right? And so they don't even
that's
necessarily
exactly
care, and Israel doesn't even necessarily care if any sort of ethno-nationalist factions that they are allied with around the world, they don't even necessarily care if they are anti-Semitic inherently at a
no. And
foundational
history
level,
shows that. The
right?
book has lots of examples of literally anti-Semitic regimes in the last half century that Israel was happy to partner with. They didn't care. Now you think, okay, if you're going to partner with the regime that literally hates you because you're Jewish, let's be clear, the arms industry by definition is amoral. It's not like, oh, the Russian arms industry is full of morality, of course. America sells about 45% of the world's weapons. And in 2023, the global arms industry was worth over $2 trillion. It was
Wow.
surging, right? In Israel, of course, is one part of that, not the only one. So I very much see the danger of what Israel is doing. And again, I was saying this long before October 7, that the ethno-nationalist agenda, India being the most obvious example, is also attracting, pardon me, many people in the global far right. And it's pretty interesting how I would argue the global left, for want of a better expression, is not coming back to Israel. That ship
Hmm.
sailed a long time ago. But the global right and the far right, I'm talking about in Italy, France,
Yep.
Germany, Sweden, parts of the US and elsewhere, UK, deeply admire what Israel is doing before October 7 and since. And as the far right grows in political popularity in the countries that it's mentioned, they're often actually in government, or they may well be. They see what Israel is doing with admiration because they both hate migrants, they both hate multiculturalism, they both see the war on Islam as a noble war, and they want to create in their own world a Christian ethno-nationalist state, not Jewish. And Israel is that model. Obviously, it's Jewish, but it's a model. And that to me is the real danger here, that there is not enough awareness that a nation which is literally 9 million people, and the last 6 months, by the way, have not changed that admiration. I see a lot of far-right figures in those countries I just mentioned increasing their support to Israel. Killing 40,000 Palestinians is irrelevant. You can kill 100,000, kill a million, kill all of them. As far as these groups are concerned, Palestinians are cockroaches and we should get rid of them.
Right.
This is how they view them. And it's pretty remarkable to me just finally that Israel is happy to partner with those kinds of groups. Groups that don't like you, I would argue, really, don't like the fact that you're Jewish. But it's I guess you call it transactional friendship or a transactional relationship, as they show in the book for the last half century. But that will eventually bite them on the ass, rest assured. And that to me, I think speaks volumes about Israel remains such a danger.
Yeah. I think it definitely gets down to, whether or not even Israel's actions right now are going to bring about any sort of peace or lasting security, even for the Israeli people. I mean,
Which
at
it
this,
won't.
it won't. I mean, at this point, it seems like it's spiraling towards,
Yes.
an even broader escalation, which brings me to my
Let's hope
final
not. Yeah.
question here for you. I know that you're a very
Yeah.
busy man, and I
It's all
appreciate you
right.
coming on the show and all of that. So I want to finish off with maybe, and I'm not requiring this of you, but if you could have any sort of glimpse of hope for the future, lay it out here and sort of what your analysis of this doom spiral that we are currently heading
Mm.
towards with a potential direct war between Israel, the United States, and Iran. Do you have any hope
Mm.
on the horizon, or is it seemingly only going to get worse from here?
I think at the moment, and of course this could change within days, I think a regional war is unlikely. Uh, Obviously, that's the caveat to that is always I can't predict exactly what Israel will do or Iran or the US, of course, I can't. But my sense for a long time has been Iran, for example, does not want a regional war because, frankly, Iran's economically weak. They're not very popular within their own country. They're a repressive state. Now, Israel, of course, has wanted for years to bring the US into a regional war. Israel knows that if they fight a direct war with Iran, they may well lose. If they have America with them, frankly, all bets are off. Who knows? And any war between Israel and, say, Hezbollah in Lebanon would make what's happening in Gaza seem like kindergarten. I mean, Hezbollah, I mean, in one level, Hamas's ability to still be surviving after 6 months is pretty remarkable. Hamas is a relatively small guerrilla force. Hezbollah is the most sophisticated guerrilla army arguably in the world. This is not saying out of admiration, it's just a statement of fact.
Right,
They have
right.
hundreds of thousands of rockets, they are backed by Iran, they are well trained. But a war between those nations, Israel and Lebanon would be flattened. And it's just a horrific scenario. I mean, if you ask what's the silver lining, my sense is still that the US, and this is not set out of big support for Joe Biden, does not want a regional war. I don't sense that they do. Now, the question is, are they going to do anything to restrain Israel to try to bring them into one? Even a few months ago, the US was saying to Israel, we do not believe you can fight two wars simultaneously, namely one in Gaza and one in Lebanon. They're not capable militarily of doing so. And frankly, after 6 months of what the US and many nations have seen in Gaza, it's kind of been a catastrophe for Israel. I mean, they've killed 40,000 Palestinians, but Hamas is still standing. The vast bulk of the hostages are, I mean, who knows, right? I suspect many of them tragically are probably dead by this stage.
Right.
And
I think it was even Haaretz came out with a recent article saying that they believe their editorial board believes that the war is effectively unwinnable given the goals that were, put in place at the
unwinnable.
outset. Right.
And I think that in the lesson that the US and Israel and Western states never learn, you'd think they would after defeat after defeat after defeat. After Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan you will not win an insurgency. When I say you, as a Western state, you will not win that war. You can militarily overwhelm someone in the first weeks, the so-called shock and awe. Saddam was overthrown in 3 weeks. The Taliban were overthrown in 3 weeks. That's not the challenge. I mean, militarily, no nation can really beat America or Israel initially. But when it comes to an insurgency, we've seen in all those countries I just mentioned, and now, frankly, in Gaza, these nations are incapable of winning that war. And I fear that unless there is a real massive pressure from, frankly, the US on Israel to not try to drag them into a regional war, to once and for all, in the Israeli thinking, take on Iran and defeat it, which I don't think is actually possible and would be disastrous. We are then moving towards a regional war. My sense is that we are not, that Iran does not want that regional war, that Iran realizes that it's a pretty big gamble to go to war with the US and Israel when you are economically weak, you're not as powerful as you think you are. And yes, you have your proxies, namely Hezbollah, but who knows who would win that? No one would actually win because vast parts of the region would be obliterated. So who wins in the end of that? People often say the Iranians are irrational. They're not. They're actually, this is not a support of Iran, but they're a very rational player. And they have said, I mean, as is often missed in this analysis, right? What Iran did in Israel yesterday by all those drone attacks on Israel was a response to a flagrantly illegal attack by Israel on a consulate in Damascus, which killed Iranians. When the media coverage would make it sound as if Iran's this crazy nation that just goes around attacking Jews because they're Jews. This is insane. Everyone needs to calm the fuck down, quite clearly. But I'd say at the moment, a chance of a complete regional war is unlikely. If Israel goes tomorrow and, assassinates the supreme leader, God help us, then obviously all bets are off, or something insane. I mean, Biden said yesterday, according to reports, that he said to Israel, we will not join you in a regional war.
What exactly does that mean?
What does that mean? Obviously, are we trusting the word of Biden after the last 6 months? Not really. But look, the silver lining is that I don't think there's a real appetite in certainly in the Arab world and in Iran for a regional war. Is there appetite within Israel for one? Netanyahu has dreamed of that war for years, and he's put pressure on pretty much every president, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, to almost give Israel permission, in a way, to join them in a war against Iran. And none of those leaders, Obama and Trump, pretty much said to Israel, we're not going there.
Yeah.
Because they, as much as Obama and Trump have their issues quite clearly, the possibility of that regional war is too scary to contemplate. So the silver lining is we have to hope that sanity prevails.
Yeah.
Which is hard to imagine with the people in charge, but God help us.
It's I mean it's definitely a challenge. I'm trying to be a little bit optimistic here. I hope that you are correct and that cooler heads prevail. I agree with you that I don't believe Iran wants a regional war. They don't want a direct war with the United States and Israel. Unfortunately, like you pointed out there, you do have some other factors at play. Namely, I think that Netanyahu wants to protect his political career and all of that. And he has an incentive to expand the war. So it's, I think a lot of it comes down to how Biden is going to even mildly behind the scenes put pressure on Israel. And, there's a lot of different terrifying factors that are currently in the mix right now. So, with that being said, I greatly appreciate you coming on the channel, giving us your time, very insightful information, and obviously highly recommend everybody goes and gets the book, The Palestine Laboratory. Fantastic read. And thanks for coming on the show. Hopefully we can have you on again soon.
Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying